Some words describe what we do. Others describe the very structure of experience itself. Samadhi belongs to the latter. Before we can understand samadhi, we first have to understand how consciousness becomes scattered. Consciousness isn't experienced as something static. It moves through perception, sensation, thought, memory, relationship, and identity within the field of prakriti, the dynamic unfolding of nature. Within this movement, attention is never neutral. Attention is participation. Where attention repeatedly gathers, energy follows. What receives our attention becomes familiar. What becomes familiar begins to shape perception, relationship, and the way we experience ourselves. Over time, these repeated movements form patterns of identification. We begin to say, "This is who I am. This is just how I am. I have always been this way." Yet yoga invites us to look more closely, not only at what we experience, but at the movements through which experience is continually shaped. From this perspective, the question isn't simply how to attain another state of consciousness. The deeper question is, how does consciousness become conditioned through the movement of attention? And if attention can become dispersed, can it also be gathered? This is the context in which Patanjali begins the Yoga Sutras. He doesn't begin with technique, he begins with yoga itself. He begins with the nature of the mind, the movements of consciousness, and samadhi, the condition in which awareness rests in its own nature. Samadhi is often misunderstood. It's described as a mystical absorption, a heightened meditative state, or a distant spiritual achievement. But when we look carefully at the Sanskrit and at Patanjali's description, a quieter understanding emerges. Samadhi isn't something added to consciousness. It's what becomes apparent when the fragmentation created through dispersed attention has settled. Before describing the disciplines of practice, Patanjali points toward the condition those disciplines ultimately serve, a state in which awareness is no longer divided by the continual movement between observer and observed. In these reflections, we begin here with samadhi as the reference point, not as something to be forced into existence, but as something to be understood. And from here, we can explore how that coherence becomes obscured, how attention becomes conditioned, and how Patanjali's Yoga Sutras describe the gradual reorganization of experience from scatteredness back into gatheredness. Through this lens, samadhi isn't simply the end of the path, it's the clarity that makes the path intelligible. It's the fulfillment of sadhana itself. The Sanskrit word samadhi is often translated as absorption, a meditative balance, or complete integration. While each of these captures an aspect of its meaning, the word itself reveals a deeper significance. Samadhi derives from sam plus a plus root da, where sam means together, completely, or wholly. A indicates movement toward, into, or fully, and the root da means to place, to set, to establish, or to arrange. Taken together, the literal sense is to place together completely, to establish firmly, or to bring into perfect integration. Unlike many Sanskrit roots that describe movement or action, da concerns placement and stability. It's the root behind words such as samadhana, which is resolution or settlement, and vidana, which means arrangement or orderly disposition. At its heart, the root describes something being settled into its proper configuration. This distinction is significant. Samadhi isn't simply an intensified form of concentration. Its very name suggests a condition in which the mind has become fully established, no longer fragmented or scattered, but absolutely gathered in its own integrative functioning. Patanjali offers one of the most concise and profound descriptions of Samadhi in Yoga Sutra 3.3. Tad eva arthamatra nirbhasam svarupa sunyam eva samadhi. A careful reading reveals the subtlety of this definition. Tad eva, that alone, artha matra, the object alone, or the object in its essential nature, nirbhasam, a shining forth, appearing clearly, svarupa sunyam iva, as if empty of its own form. The final word iva, as if, is especially important. Patanjali doesn't say that the mind literally disappears. Rather, it's as if the mind has become empty of its own separate form because it no longer asserts itself as an independent center of experience. What remains isn't unconsciousness, blankness, or the absence of awareness. Awareness remains fully present, but its ordinary division into observer and the observed no longer dominates experience. We can understand these three final limbs as a progressive refinement of attention within meditation. Each describes a subtle shift in the relationship between awareness and its object, revealing how attention becomes increasingly stable, continuous, and gathered. Dhāraṇā comes from the root dhar, to hold or to support. Here, the practitioner intentionally steadies attention on a single chosen object, such as the breath, a mantra, or a visual image. The relationship between observer and the object remains distinct, but attention is no longer allowed to wander freely. Dhyāna, from the root dhya, to contemplate or to meditate, is defined by Patanjali as the uninterrupted continuity of that attention. As steadiness develops through dharana, attention begins to flow more effortlessly toward its object. Instead of repeatedly bringing the mind back, awareness starts to remain within what is being observed. Moments of distraction become less frequent, and the relationship between observer and the object becomes increasingly continuous. Samadhi completes the progression as attention becomes fully established. In Dhāraṇā, attention is deliberately sustained. In Dhyāna, attention begins to sustain itself. In Samadhi, the distinction between the observer and the object is no longer experienced as a separation. It's as though the object stands out distinctly on its own, while the mind becomes as if empty of its own separate form. In other words, awareness remains completely gathered. Nothing new has been added, and awareness hasn't disappeared. Rather, the effort of maintaining attention has fallen away because attention has become completely and fully established in its relationship with what is being known. So, samadhi isn't an intensified form of concentration, but the fulfillment of concentration. Attention has become so gathered, so stable, and so completely established that effort naturally gives way to effortless continuity. The Sanskrit roots of the eight limbs reveal an architecture of consciousness, a progressive movement from regulation to stability to gathering to complete establishment. They trace a remarkable inward movement. Yama, the root yam, to regulate relationship. Niyama, the root yam, is to cultivate inner relationship. Asana, the root as, is to establish stability. Pranayama, the roots an and ayama, is to refine the movement of life force. Pratyahara, the root is to draw the senses inward. Dhāraṇā, the root is to hold attention upon one object. Dhyāna, the root dhya, is to sustain uninterrupted contemplation. And Samādhi, the root dha, is to complete establishment. The progression is striking. The early limbs are expressed through the verbs of discipline and regulation. They require deliberate cultivation. With pratyahara, the movement turns inward as the senses are gently withdrawn from the habitual engagement with external objects. The final three limbs become increasingly subtle. The language shifts from holding to flowing, contemplation to complete establishment. Seen together, these movements reveal that the eight limbs aren't separate practices, but refinement of a single movement, the gradual gathering of what has become dispersed. Yama, the gathering, begins relationally. How do I relate? How do my actions affect the field of relationship? Niyama, the gathering, moves inward. How do I relate to myself? What conditions am I cultivating internally? Asana, the gathering, enters the body. Can I become steady enough to inhabit experience? Pranayama, the gathering, enters vitality. Can I refine the movement of energy? Pratyahara, the gathering, turns the senses inward. Can I recognize where attention is habitually pulled? Dhāraṇā, the gathering, becomes intentional. Can attention remain with what I choose? Dhyāna, the gathering, becomes continuous. Can awareness remain uninterrupted? And Samādhi, the gathering, is completely established. This progression finds its natural completion in the relationship between Samadhi and Sadhana. The word sadhana derives from the root sad, which means to accomplish, to bring to completion, to realize, or to establish successfully. Sadhana is therefore more than practice in the ordinary sense. It's the disciplined process through which conditions are brought into alignment so that realization becomes possible. Seen in this light, Samadhi isn't separate from sadhana. It's its fulfillment. The earlier limbs cultivate the relationship that make gathered attention possible. They refine our relationship with others, with ourselves, with the body, with the breath, energy, and the senses. They don't create samadhi. Rather, they prepare the conditions in which awareness can gradually become completely established. Like a fruit ripening on a healthy tree, samadhi isn't forced into existence. It emerges when the preceding stages have matured. This understanding is reflected in the structure of Patanjali's work itself. He doesn't begin by teaching techniques. Instead, the Yoga Sutras open with yoga, the nature of the mind, and samadhi, the goal to which the entire path points. Only afterward, in the Sadhanapada, does he describe the disciplines through which the mind becomes prepared for its realization. The movement of the text mirrors the movement of practice. Vision precedes discipline, and discipline culminates in realization. Samadhi is therefore not simply the eighth limb to be mastered. It's the condition that naturally unfolds when the work of sadhana has reached its fulfillment. The Sanskrit roots of the eight limbs quietly narrate a single movement of consciousness. From this perspective, samadhi isn't something added to the mind, but what remains when the restless tendencies that divide experience have been patiently resolved through sadhana. The path, therefore, unfolds from regulation to recollection, from effort to continuity, and from continuity to complete establishment. Samadhi isn't the final thing one does. It's the point at which there is nothing further to do because awareness has become absolutely gathered, effortlessly established, and quietly at rest in its own undivided nature. Maybe this is why Patanjali presents Samadhi not as an extraordinary achievement to be pursued, but as the quiet flowering of a well prepared mind. When the mind has become steady, the breath regulated, energy refined, the senses gathered inward, and attention no longer pulled into countless directions, awareness settles into its own natural clarity. Nothing new has been added, nothing new has been acquired. Instead, what obscured the mind's inherent stability has gradually fallen away. The Sanskrit roots quietly tell the story. Each limb isn't a step towards something else, but a refinement of the conditions in which awareness becomes undivided. Awareness is simply established, not as something attained, but as what remains when dispersion is no longer active. For me, this is one of the quiet beauties of the Yoga Sutras. Their wisdom isn't found only in what they teach, but also in the language through which they teach it. The Sanskrit does more than define the limbs, it reveals the rhythm of the path itself, guiding us from disciplined effort toward effortless abiding. Every path has a direction. The Sanskrit roots of the eight limbs suggest that yoga's direction isn't outward toward achievement, but inward toward complete establishment. And maybe this is why Patanjali begins with Samadhi and only afterward speaks of sadhana. We don't practice Samadhi, we practice sadhana. And Samadhi is the fulfillment that sadhana quietly points to. Slow down, gather yourself, and return to what is true.